Okay, we're live. So, welcome to Dive into World Building. This is a very exciting day for me because we have this is not our first ever guest author, but this is the first of my new vision for guest authors, and I'm really excited about it. We are joined today by Aliette de Bodard, who is joining us from Paris. And thank you for being here, Aliette. She's very awesome. She's got lots and lots of stories published and novels, and she works with Aztec Times and has her own universe called the Xuya universe, and she's got a new novel that's going to be coming out, so she's here to talk about all of those things potentially and her world building. And so I'm very excited to have you here, Aliette. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for the offer, and I'm kind of nervous but excited.
That was the official part of the thing. So anybody who this is, and now we can just chat. So why don't I ask you first about your new novel, because that's pretty exciting.
Okay, sure. My new novel's coming out August 2015 from Gollancz in the Commonwealth. So, insofar as I understand, sadly, this is everywhere except the U.S. for the moment.
Okay.
And it's set in a post-apocalyptic version of Paris, which was nuked by the Great Magician's War, which is sort of this world's alternative to World War One. And the city is ruled by a series of feudal houses that are in turn controlled by fallen angels. And this is what happens in one of the oldest of these houses, which was founded by Lucifer Morningstar, and what happens when three different people get together. So a very young, very powerful, but very naive fallen angel, a Vietnamese immortal who has a grudge and a lot of experience, and an alchemist who is addicted to a drug ground from fallen angel bones, which gives the user like tremendous magical powers, but also rots your lungs from the inside out. So obviously, as a kind of big lifespan thing, this is not it.
Yeah, yeah. Wow.
So that's about it.
There's a lot to talk about there. Let me ask you, actually, I remember talking to you about this book before we had the announcement that you had sold it, and you said to me that you were writing this thing and that it just wasn't interesting enough, so you nuked Paris. Can you tell us a little bit about how you decided to change to a post-apocalyptic scenario and what that did for you in terms of making the story come to life? Are you there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, I got to Nuke Paris, and that was about it.
Oh, okay, sorry. So I just wanted to see.
The question was how I came to Nuke Paris?
Yes, exactly. How it changed the story.
Well, it started as a urban fantasy set in Paris in the 21st centuries, and it had instead of magicians' houses, it had big magician families who controlled like banking, politics, and everything. Because obviously, if you have magic, well, you kind of get an edge on the whole power thing. And the main character was a Vietnamese second generation who was had married into one of those families and was having problems dealing with was essentially a traditional French power structure and a very snotty French power structure. And so that was the idea, and my agent had told me make it commercial, so I was like, urban fantasy commercial, we're doing great. I mean, compared with the Aztec noir mystery thing, that cross-genre thing that nobody wanted to buy, this is like good. Except that when I sent him the sample, he got back to me and he said, we need to talk. And the essence of the talk was, it's like good on paper, but I don't think your heart's really in it. I took a good look at it and I was like, well, as usual, you're right. And never argue with your agent about that sort of thing. And I was basically, there's nothing about this setting that particularly excites me. And and I also can't really make it work. I wanted the magic to be not so overt, but then how would it have remained underground for so many centuries and people would not have found out about it and so on and so forth? I was running into like lots of word building knots. And I was like, oh fuck, I know what. Let's just nuke Paris. And I had this story that was set in a city called Silver Spires actually, and that was in a world where you had angel lag beings who fell. Like, they don't remember anything, so for all, they could not be angels. They just fit in the Christian mythos. And it was about this drug traffic and this drug that they made from the bones of angels ground into dust, and it was a highly addictive drug, and the main character was trying to solve this kind of murder mystery thing about the traffic, and ended up going head-to-head with Lucifer Morningstar. And so the story never really got anywhere. I mean, I have it, but it's not great. But I was like discussing with a very good friend of mine, Rachita London Ruse, and I talked about the story, and she was like, you should put that into a novel. And I was like, actually, I could put that into my current novel. That might improve matters. And I don't know why I knew Paris. It just felt better that way.
Kind of a merger of two concepts.
Yeah.
I'm fascinated by the drug made of angel bones. How did you come up with that?
I saw an episode of Bones, actually, in which I can't exactly remember the episode. It was set in a hospital, and someone had done something to a body which involved sewing the bones. And at one point, like Bones and what's his name, Booth, go into the hospital, and they confront this person, and they go, incidentally, bone dust is highly corrosive and it's bad for your lungs. And it sort of went sideways into my brain, and I thought, well, it could be corrosive to your lungs, but it could also be great. And I don't know why the angel, because I've always had this sort of like very creepy vibe going on.
That's really interesting. I think there's a lot of value in mixing it up so that you have to engage a lot more in the complexity of the environment. In a way, like Paris obviously really, really well. So I think that it must be kind of exciting to say, well, okay, so if this happened, then what would change? And it gets an interesting level of engagement where you're discovering things all the time instead of necessarily saying, well, I know this really well. I don't know if that's how you felt about it, but that was my immediate impression from hearing what you described.
Well, I mean, it's not a history-intensive novel, obviously. I mean, I nuked Paris, hollowed out Notre Dame, made a magical house inside the Sorbonne, and had them fall. So it's not what I would call it's not like the Obsidian and Blood book where I had to intensely research everything. It's more a sort of sideways universe that uses Paris and the history of Paris as its inspiration. So I did a lot of research, but it was very different research. It was more like mining the history for ideas, and for book 2 as well, I'm planning on using a lot of that stuff. And a lot of it was going for that fin de siècle feeling from the Belle Époque, which basically is where they sort of got stuck, technologically speaking, because that's where everything blew in their faces, and they've never really been able to rebuild it even 50 years afterwards. So it's a more, I guess, impressionistic.
Right. So you're placing the apocalypse right around 1914, right?
Yeah, 1940. Well, it is the equivalent of World War I, except fought between magicians and angels.
Right.
Well,
that's very, very cool. I liked what you said about mining the history for ideas. This sounds like an amazing story, and I'm looking forward to seeing it. I wonder if we could move sideways, though. Can you contrast a little bit if your research for House of Shattered Wings was mining history for ideas, how would you characterize your research for the Obsidian and Blood series?
The Obsidian and Blood series was more a reading up history to make sure I didn't fuck up too much. Although, to be fair, it's really hard because, because the culture as it was back then, was pretty thoroughly exterminated by the Spanish. And I mean, if I had to do it again, what I would actually need to do is talk, because there's still an extent now about population in Mexico, and they have a contact point, and I would probably use that in addition to written sources.
Yeah.
The Obsidian and Blood books, I mainly use written sources, and there's the big issue of having most of them written by Spaniards. Who,
right.
Pretty much your textbook outsider with bad intentions, or good intentions, but not really understanding. I mean, it's very clear that there was a big cultural misunderstanding. I don't want to say that, if they had managed to talk to one another, they probably would not have exterminated the Aztecs. They would have. They definitely would have. But one of the anecdotes that I found out, that I read about while reading the Obsidian and Blood books, was the Aztecs were shocked when the Spanish tortured people to find where they had hidden their gold, because to them, pain and blood were a sacred thing, and you didn't go around cheapening them by using torture on people just to find where you hid gold. And the Spaniards were horrified because, obviously, hey, human sacrifice, we don't do human sacrifice. And you have lots of misunderstandings like that. Their notions of war were also very different. I mean, for the Spaniards, it was basically anything goes. It was the notion of, early notions of total war. We, nuke everything to the ground, and that's the end of the war. For the Aztecs, the end of the war was when the temple fell. After that, there was looting, pillaging, so on and so forth. I'm not saying it was clean, but they couldn't understand why the Aztecs and the Spanish wouldn't stop. And so there's lots of things like that make it clear that when you have a Spanish person like Sahagún writing the Codex Florentine, how much of what he was transcribing did he really understand is a question that's up for grabs.
Right. And that's, that's always a problem when, we were recently doing a report with my daughter, and she was researching this tribe, which is now known as the Saline, who actually live slightly south. Live slightly south of here. There are still Saline tribe members around, and one of the things we learned was that the name of the tribe was changed by the Spanish, so they aren't really the Saline.
Okay.
Yeah. So I mean, there was a lot. There's just a ton that was rewritten. And then, of course, there's also the factor that these populations were devastated by disease before the really big wars even. So they were weakened in their ability to wage war by the diseases that the Europeans had brought with them. So just a couple of things to add. But yes, it's a fascinating time, and also very, very difficult to reconstruct. So very interesting. Yeah. So I think that I get the sense from you that you like to try to do insider viewpoints on a lot of these things. Do you have any thoughts to share on how you pick your points of view and that kind of thing?
Well, I mostly pick my points of view because I'm a contrarian, and there's a lot of fantasy and SF that's done from outsider point of view, and in particular with the Obsidian and Blood books, the feeling that I had was that there was a lot of novels that were written from Spanish point of view, or that even were written from a supposed insider point of view, but that still depicted the Aztecs as bloodthirsty, evil savages who ravaged civilizations for the fun of it.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a bee, and the bee escaped me. Oh, and the bee was that they tended to all focus on the conquest, and so they depicted the civilization as basically dying, and they sort of went a little heavy on the foreshadowing of, this is a civilization that has flaws, and therefore it is doomed, and very clearly this is
Oh,
survival
okay, yeah.
civilization style. So I think, the tricky thing to do with insider point of view is you have to change your entire mindset, and to some extent that is impossible, because your mindset is kind of the air you breathe. It is what you grew up with. It is the things that you see, that you read, that you experience every day that reinforce it. So there's a bedrock of hidden assumptions and not so hidden assumptions that you carry with you. They're hard to set aside. So I try to read as much of primary sources from within the culture as I can, but before I do that, I usually take a sample of secondary sources. Secondaries are not secondary, it's more like insider versus outsider. Because the thing is, insider narrative for insiders does not pause to explain. So that's good because you get the mindset. But unless you're already somewhat attuned to what's happening, you have no idea. For instance, I have this book called Stories to Warn the World. I can't actually remember who the author is. Chinese author, 16th century Ming Dynasty. And in a lot of stories, you have references to women being carried in palanquins. And there's a little note that says, actually, the reasons they're being carried in palanquins because they could not walk, because they had bound feet. And of course,
they had what feet?
Bound feet.
Okay.
Of course, the author does not pose to explain that to you. He assumes that you know. You're a 16th century Ming Chinese. Of course, all girls have bound feet, and there's no need to actually explain in excruciating detail what everybody would know. And similarly, if I write a story that, say, is set in France for a French audience, there's a lot of things that I'm not going to need to pause to explain because everybody knows. So when you read a source that is written by an insider, there's a lot that you run the risk of applying your own biases and assumptions and missing what they're trying to tell you if you don't have a little background already.
Right, because you're filling in these blanks where things are not explained.
Yeah, you're basically filling it, and you're filling it with, well, what you have in your mind, and there's a strong chance that what you have in your mind is like digging into that bedrock of assumptions you're carrying around if you're not careful.
Right. Very interesting. Yep. Okay, so wow. There's a lot here, but so why don't we talk about? So why don't we move sideways again? Why don't we talk a little bit about your Xuya universe? And can you give us maybe a little bit of an introduction to what that is?
Okay, Xuya is my alternate history universe, which is basically an excuse to have a slightly different blend of cultures in the future than we currently have. So it started out as I wanted a chance for the Chinese and Aztec cultures to talk to each other. So the way I came up with was China discovers America ahead of Europe, and therefore the Aztec Empire never falls. And it sort of expanded then into a spacefaring age, which was mainly dominated by Asia, and in particular by China, and recently branched out into Imperial Vietnam because I've been doing a lot of personal research into Vietnamese history.
Okay, so do you actually have? I'm just curious. Do you actually have the whole sequence of how they got to the space age from this point of divergence all mapped out, or is this something where you figure it out as you go along?
I have the divergence sort of with little dotted lines how they get from the divergence to the 20th century. So the 20th century has a tripartite North America, which with the bottom half being occupied by the Aztecs, the Dominion, what I call the Dominion, which is kind of the new version of the Aztec Empire. The eastern coast being a smaller version of the United States, and the west coast being occupied by Xuya, which is the name of that the Chinese colony took upon independence.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's a sort of like hand-waving period where I go, they go into space, trust me, they do.
Awesome.
And they scatter and they colonize planets. Trust me, that happens. And then I've got what I do have mapped is how in this universe there's what I call shipminds, which are basically artificial intelligences that are conceived by engineers, carried by human mothers in a sort of very protracted and very dangerous pregnancy, and then plugged into a ship where they become like the moving force for the ship. And so I have the timeline that gets to the development of this from a society which has interfaces and plugins, neural plugins for pilots, but not yet artificial intelligence. That's reasonably mapped out.
So, I'd actually been kind of wondering about the ship minds. Are they organic? Like, I mean, obviously they're being carried by human mothers, so
they're a mix of organic and whatever non-organic is, metallic, technological, optics, electronics, and organic.
Huh. Interesting. Okay. Cool. So, well, we have a whole history that we could figure out. Is the Xuya are the ones who are doing the most space travel, or are the Aztec? I can't remember the name of them. Also involved in that?
Well, I mean, at the point at which I'm writing most of the space cycle stories, everybody's got space travel. It's just that people have, and everybody's got the Shipmind technology. It's just that people have like very different attitudes to it. So the Xuyan and the Xuyans and Asian Shipminds live very long, and they're like an integrated part of families. The Mexica, the Aztecs tend to consider them more as enlisted soldiers, and they generally do not live that long because there's an operation that you have to do when you conceive the ship that the Mexica don't bother to do because it's costly. They don't see the point. And the United, like the Anglo-European population is a little uneasy about the whole business of artificial intelligence. So it's like it's splintered. It's like obviously like people scattered around dozens of planets are not going to have like very coherent. Like it's not it's not a small country. It's like planets, so you have like very different factions and civilizations. But by and large, the Europeans are still catching up. So they have the technology and they're sort of trying to understand how that works, and like they're at the point where they got past the emotional reaction of we're not doing that to our women, and they're trying to make it work for them, basically.
That's really interesting. I wonder, what is there anything addressed about the reproductive rights or how that works regarding gender in this world, and like using human beings essentially and their parts as commodities in a sense to build this?
Okay. Well, again, it kind of depends. Okay. Seem to have lost someone. Okay. It kind of depends which civilization and what time frame we're talking about. The Suyan and Asian societies are they consider that having a mind is an honor, and it's not only is it one more child who will become part of the family and who will essentially ships also take part in family reunions, and they're raised by their mothers and so on and so forth. So it's not like you're sacrificing your body to the state and then the ship becomes belongs to the state.
Mm-hmm.
They feel it's a great honor, and that you also get essentially what is a living ancestor in that culture, someone who doesn't die for a couple of centuries and is actually the family's living memory. So the prestige of that is incredible. It works on a voluntary basis, and they actually have to turn people away because it takes like a team of 15 people, 15 scientists to design a ship. The mother is sort of not the most complex thing. The Mexica tend to view it more as a duty, and they pay people to do it. Like as to gender roles, the Mexican society is a very very segregated society. You can changing gender is very easy, but if you're in a gender, you have to perform your gender, and the students mostly don't care.
Okay. Wow.
Well, I mean, this is such a huge concept that, that there's just a lot that we could talk about and discover. So let me get my brain together here. I think this is a good way to segue to one of the thoughts that I had coming in, which was the way that you handle family in your Xuya culture, which I think is fantastic, and I wonder if you could share some thoughts on that. So, for example, you started just now with the idea that a Shipmind would actually be part of a family and considered to be a child of the family, and would also be able to contribute to that family through its long life and ability to remember things. So I wonder if you could kind of segue from that into the value of family in this culture, and maybe also mention the ancestor implants.
Yeah, sure. A lot of Xuya is based on Imperial China and later Imperial Vietnam, which has a lot of common points with China. And I mean, to me personally, family is a very important thing. So I always tend to put like families in my stories, and if possible, usually with short stories, not possible, but if possible, extended families, which also include aunts and cousins and uncles and whatnot. And one of the things that I was really interested in was how having new technologies would change the relationship between families. So I already mentioned the Shipminds and the fact that you essentially have to deal with two very different kind of children, one of whom is going to basically have the same lifespan as you and more or less the same capacities as you. That's the easy one, and God knows it's already not easy. And then you're going to have to deal with a Shipmind who's going to live for centuries, who's going to have a very different idea of what they do, because obviously they're so huge that they actually can only be in orbit, and they only participate in family life if everyone comes on board or through avatars projected back on the planet. So they have a very different experience of belonging to that family. One other thing that I did in this culture was it's like ancestor worship is obviously a very important part of Chinese and Vietnamese culture, and it's the notion that your ancestors not only are worth worshipping and remembering, but also that they help you from beyond the grave. And I decided to make that literal, which is that you can record a simulation of your ancestors. There's not people don't believe that those are your actual ancestors' souls. Those spirits and souls go away, and they they are reborn, and so they're not people that you pray to. They're not your actual ancestors. They're just a sim, and a very simplified sim. And they basically give you advice. And this is very important because we're dealing with a culture that still has imperial examinations as a pathway into civil service. So you have to be able to memorize and comment on the classics of Chinese literature, which is a huge amount of memorization and a huge amount of work. And obviously, if you have four ancestors who did that before you, and you get their implants in your brain, okay, it might get a little chaotic, and you're going to have to sift through the advice, but you have an advantage compared with some poor son who barely learned to read and is still trying to understand the highly stylized way of doing things of the civil service. So that was the idea of mem implants. And in the recent novella that I'm working on, obviously, which is set in the imperial family, they obviously have a better class of implants, which is they can actually dedicate an entire wing of the palace to running simulations of previous emperors. And when you have a problem, you go see your 24 or 25 emperor ancestors and ask them, look, I'm having this big diplomatic thing with the neighboring empire. What did you do exactly? Although they do have a habit of popping in and announcing and said, incidentally, I highly disapprove of your liaison with that general. You really should not be sleeping with him. Always positive, obviously.
Well, you know, and what it does is it takes that sense of the extended family and the extended family complications, and it just expands it so incredibly much more, right? All of a sudden, instead of dealing with your crazy aunt, you've got your 24th grandmother breathing down your neck, you know. So,
are there neurotic AIs?
Are there?
Like neurotic? Disturbed, like?
Oh yeah, sure. First off, if you don't do the stabilization procedure properly, you essentially end up with some like design flaws that mean that they're not functioning properly. But you also have different mindsets and different things happening. And I had one in a short story that basically went through a very traumatic war and sort of lost it.
Oh, wow.
Was this a ship?
Yeah, a ship.
Mm-hmm.
Who basically decided that they were not going to play the game anymore, which is nice, but when you're a ship with weapons of mass destruction, is a little uncomfortable for everybody involved.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
So let's see, can the ancestors also end up being a little off?
I haven't touched on it, but theoretically they could because of electronics decay and successive recopies. So I'm guessing that the more distant the ancestor and the less the family could invest in actually some durable and expert support system, the more likely it is that you'd have corrupted data and things going a little funky. But there's no neurosis that would come from the fact of, oh my god, I'm a living ancestor, because there's not enough, they know they're simulation, so there's...
Oh, I see.
It's not like they're pretending that they're alive. They know they're dead. And they sort of didn't import the whole emotional... They removed the parts that they thought would not contribute to the stability of the actual ancestors. It's sort of like, trying to go for the encyclopedia approach, helpful advice, helpful knowledge, but we don't really angst kind of thing. So everybody who interacts with them sort of has the same reaction to them, which is, and it's especially hard when they're your immediate ancestors, because they're like, it's the advice, but it's not the person.
All right.
And it sort of looks like them, but not quite.
Yeah. Right.
I'm so quiet because I'm still thinking about the implications of an AI and the lack of personality versus how the neural analog would manifest.
So my sense, Aliette, from what I've read of your work, is that the AI ship minds actually have more personality than the ancestors. Because
Yeah.
they're sort of grown rather than simulated.
Well, the AIs are meant to be people. So, and they're actually, I mean, part of the paradigm also is because they're designed by human beings, they end up who basically want someone they can relate to. They also end up sounding very human.
Mm-hmm.
With some modifications, obviously, living for a few
You
days.
know, the whole fact of being connected to a ship.
Yeah, being connected to a ship and so on and so forth. But they're very personable, for want of a better word. You can relate to them and so on and so forth. Whereas the ancestors are explicitly designed as helpful simulations, so they're not actually meant to have anything. They're a bit like Siri, you're not meant to actually have a meaningful conversation with Siri for more than a few seconds. It's just like Siri, where is my, I don't know, where is the weather going to be like in California this time of year?
Yeah. So, let's see. Why don't I open up to some more general questions? Other people who would like to ask something?
I don't have a general question, but I do have a question, and now I'm thinking about what would happen if someone were to conspire to steal a simulation or an AI or a ship. Like, what would the implications and complications of that be? I don't know if you've addressed any of that, but I'm just like, my brain is going weird places.
Well, on a red station drifting, someone does steal implants. Well, actually, they don't steal implants, but like someone who has ancestor implants in their head sells them for profit. And so you can. However, if you attempt to graft them onto someone else, the results can be unpredictable because they're not your family, so they might not be helpful. And they might, a neural implant that is not helpful can have very serious consequences for your brain. So it's a dangerous procedure, but the gain, of course, being entering into the civil service and basically a job for life and prestige and so on and so forth, people pay a lot for these. Stealing a ship is a lot more difficult because that's essentially like kidnapping. And kidnapping a I don't know how many tons warship with a mind of its own. I
can't see that going well.
Well, I have a novella in progress where they don't steal a ship, but they hack it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But it's essentially like tough to pull off. It requires a little army.
Well, unless you're sort of brainwashing the ship, and that's perhaps what you mean by hacking it. Then they're so powerful that it would be very hard to get them to do things against their will.
Yeah, you sort of don't want a pissed off ship after you.
Yeah. Indeed.
But I mean, yeah, I see a comment from Che that a ship could also run away from them. Yeah, they do. They can. I mean, obviously people are not going to be happy about it if it happens because it's a lot of resources that you just poured that one down the drain, but it's the same as your kid running away from home. Really, there's nothing you can do to prevent them. And well, your kid to the power of 10, because obviously bringing a ships back is going to be a little more complicated than bringing the kid back.
Yeah. You can't just take them by the hand and drag them home.
No, not so much. You have to convince them that they really want to come home. It's tricky.
Yeah. Okay, so very cool.
How much autonomy do in normal use, not these strange cases, but how much autonomy do the ships have? Are they acting on their own, or do they have a human crew that's directing them, or?
They have a human crew, partly for company and partly for like some things like weapon system and life support system, for instance. Well, I mean, it's a self-perpetuating circle, obviously, but they're not built with a life support system, so the crew has to operate that. And also partly for company. And in the normal course of things, they're used as transport because they can access deep spaces, which are kind of like hyperspace, and so it's a shortcut for traveling through space. So they take on passengers, and to take on passengers and so on, you also have to have a crew for food and so on and so forth. But the crew, however, does not decide where the ship goes.
Okay. They probably discuss with the ship where the ship goes, and then the ship goes. More questions? Because I have a question, but I don't want to. If we're in a hot spot, I don't want to derail what people are thinking about. Okay, so let me ask you about the deep spaces for a second. Did you intentionally say to yourself, well, I have to reconceptualize how faster than light travel would work, and here's how I'm going to do it? Or was it just a sort of a? Do you know what I'm saying?
I sort of can, yeah. It's well, I needed faster than light travel, so and the idea was that they would reach into spaces where time and space got a little weird, and because it gets complicated to navigate those spaces and making sure that you actually get through them in one piece, that's why they had the ships. So that was the idea, but it didn't go much further. And again, in the novella that I'm currently working on, I go into a little bit more detail on the nature of deep spaces, and I have a research team of scientists trying to understand how they work and how the deepest ones where the ships can go but the humans can't work.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if the ships, because I understand the distinction between the simulation and the ship AI. Are they capable of deception, and what would they do in deep space if they were, had some kind of ulterior motive, just as a ship? Does that happen in your world?
That can, yeah. Just as you're free to, go and stab your neighbor if you feel like it. I mean, they can lie. There's no problem. They're persons, so they can do whatever they feel like. And part of the challenge of raising them is instilling in self sufficiently good moral framework so that they don't actually go running away. Although there are ways to destroy a ship that would do that kind of thing. It's pretty much accepted that, a ship in deep spaces could basically jettison its entire crew if it felt like it, because they're the ones who control the process of going through deep spaces. However, that ship would then face some serious trouble. It's pretty much understood that this is the foundation on which space travel rests. So if they do that, the ship is not going to survive. And
right.
There's a sort of it's harder to get a ship to comply with the law, but there are ways.
Okay.
Although in this case, it would probably involve disintegrating it just for good measure, but.
Mm-hmm. So, I noticed that a lot of your stories, I'm trying to think, certainly a lot of the Xuya stories focus on female protagonists. I can't, I'm not quite reading what the gender of your protagonist in your new novel is. Do you have a sense of what you do with gender and your protagonist? Is it something that you choose carefully, or I
didn't used to, but I do now. Part of the thing that I had to do with. I mean, I tend towards female as a default because there's so much male as a default. Again, I'm a bit of a contrarian, I'm afraid. So there a lot of feedback on my earlier draft of stories tend to be, but where are all the men? Which incidentally never happens when you have an all-male story. So there you go. In my new novel, there's the alchemist is female, the fallen angel it's about 50-50, but slightly more skewed towards female. The Vietnamese immortal, who's one of the very big characters, who is the through line through the novel, is male. But that was actually originally he started off as female, and I explained when I was brainstorming the entire thing, I was like, oh, I have too many female characters, and this is not the way I want this to go, so I made him male. And I'm also trying to put women in positions where they usually are not. So, for instance, we have the head of the most powerful house in Paris, who would tend to be a male, and I did not make her. I made her a female because I felt that would be going against the grain, and I think it's very different dynamics. And there's also at some point a character dies, and I'm not gonna spoil who dies or why.
Yeah, yes. Keep it under vague wraps.
Yeah, but I did not want that character to be a woman because it would have been very close to fridging. And because there are also a lot of other male characters and so on. I mean, part of what I'm also trying to do is, I don't obviously want to fridge all male characters. But I kind of feel that there's enough books that show men in a dominant position, and that if that's what you like gender-wise, you can find some. And it's harder to find books where you actually have strong female character and who are doing things and not waiting to be rescued, or the girlfriend or the prize or something. So I try to be equalitarian in my novels. In my short stories generally there's just not enough space to actually have a sort of spread of characters. But in my novels I tend to go for equality. But if in doubt, I'm going to bend slightly more towards female characters. Because of the current status quo.
Okay, cool. Great. Other questions? Anybody? I mean, so let me recap a little bit. Aliette's got her Aztec universe, and then what we've been talking about most recently, the Xuya alternate history, spacefaring awesomeness universe, and then the post-apocalyptic Paris with fallen angels universe. So there's a lot of ground that we've covered here, and we're getting towards the end, but we still have about 10 minutes. So hopefully you guys can help me out here and come up with some questions about maybe details of these different worlds, or about the research that Aliette has done.
I have a question. This is kind of like fluffy, I guess, compared to the rest of the conversation. But when it comes to research, what is your favorite part of doing that? Because I feel like there's your list of questions that you have to research, and then there's the actual reading and integrating into the prose then.
Mostly I would buying the books, I guess, but
yeah, that would probably be awesome.
Yeah. I'll basically do research in a couple stages. I do research before a project where I'll read up on the time period or a setting that interests me in order to have a sort of running background of stuff in my mind when I'm writing the novel, because it's kind of hard writing in a vacuum. And then there's bits and pieces where I really need specific things when I'm writing the novel that I don't want to stop for research. So, for instance, they crossed this bridge, which is on the Seine. Okay, I kind of know what the bridge looks like, and I don't really need to know like when it was built or exactly its name or something. So I will usually leave some little square bracket things that says research this a little more carefully, please. And then when I'm finished with the draft, I will like go back and fill in those blanks.
Mm-hmm.
Do research to fill in those blanks, and then there's revision research, which is the same thing, but in the revision pass, which like the pre-book research tends to be for like large-scale things, and the in-book research tends to be for like small details. But that's not an absolute rule, of course.
So I have a question. Do you do most of your research in English or in French or both? Depends on maybe what the books you find are, but I was just curious.
I have a preference for English because I'm writing in English, and so when I do research, I can like sort of transfer it almost immediately without having to do like complicated maneuvers with languages in my head or with a dictionary. Especially with highly technical historical terms, there is one accepted English translation, and you have to find it, and I don't know it. So it's like it saves me the trouble of having to Google for it or look it up in a dictionary if I can have it in English. But and especially with a lot of the research that I do on other cultures, the corpus of existing stuff in English is not always enough. I've read books in French, I've read them in Spanish. I've even done Wikipedia Vietnam, which is really hard because my Vietnamese sucks. But especially for some of the more esoteric stuff, I mean, one of the last research thing I did was I needed to name an empress for my Vietnamese galactic empire, and I have no idea what the naming I have a fair idea of what the Vietnamese naming conventions are for emperors, but I don't actually know the actual words that they use because they're very old Chinese words. So I went back, retro-engineered the entire timeline of the Nguyen dynasty, the last Vietnamese dynasty, and like translated all their names into English, which took me a while, again, because they're like words that tend not to be in my dictionary. At some point, I was actually having a Google Translate window from Chinese to Vietnamese open and trying a few words to see if that worked, because Sino-Vietnamese is basically Chinese translated to Vietnamese. So. And actually, from Chinese to Vietnamese, Google Translate is not bad.
Wow. Okay, that sounds really amazing. Che had a question. How fast do you write? Because you sound like you're an incredibly prolific person.
I research very slowly, so I write fast. I tend to basically I take the engineer approach to this, which is I would rather do the modifications at the outline stage because it's faster. If I have to rename a character, it kind of is fast, or change the gender. It is like cost efficient to do it at the outline stage rather than having to edit my entire draft. I have very, very bad memory of a novel I wrote when I was 16, where I decided that the main character was going to change gender from being an it to being a he. I will not do that again. It was 200,000 words of sheer misery, and I'm pretty sure there are still references. It's okay, I'm never going to publish that novel anyway. Bad story, basically. But I mean, with a typical short story, I generally have, I don't know, anywhere between a couple of weeks to a month's worth of research, but I can write a first draft in 3 days.
Wow.
That's assuming the baby cooperates.
No.
Doesn't happen that often. But I live in hope.
Yeah, that's good. It'll get easier. And then there's, of course, school, which changes things a lot. So
yeah,
that was a big change for me when my kids started going to school. So, but obviously, at a certain point, it seems like it's a long way off. So.
Yeah, still some time to go before that happens.
Okay, well, so it's 10:55. I'm happy to wrap it up anytime. If we have, are there any more questions? You guys have been great. Aliette, thank you so much for joining us.
No problem. Thank you very much for the chat. It was
your
nice.
Your work is so interesting, and there's so much to the world building that that I think a lot of us are kind of just sort of sitting here going, "Wow."
Okay. I hope I haven't scared you.
There's we have 3 different universes that we're looking at, and there's a huge breadth to it. And we talked a little bit about gender, but there's just always so much more to discover. So. Again, the book House of Shattered Wings is coming out in 2015, but maybe not in the U.S. So those of us in the U.S. will have to just cross our fingers that it leaps across the ocean. And in the meantime, Aliette has a lot of work out there already that you can purchase or find in various ways. And go find her books and read them because they're awesome. I will say that having read early drafts of a few of them. So, thank you. So let's see. Next week, it's another specially scheduled session. We're going to be meeting on, I believe it is the 13th. Let me just make sure that I know what I'm talking about. December 13th at 5 p.m. Pacific, we're going to talk with Maurice Broaddus, and so that should be really, really fun. And again, I'm going to be opening the Hangout early for people to straggle in so that we can ideally start on time, which would be really fun. So great. I hope to see you then. Obviously, Aliette, that time's going to be a little rough for you. So, but anyway, you're welcome back anytime. Anytime you can sneak it in. And I'm going to stop the broadcast here. Thanks, everybody, for being here.